Welcome back. You're watching the Press Club. Before the break, we were talking about the Jafali fallout and the headline for the Star newspaper and the editorial for The Voice. Also the subject of a number of letters on the Voice newspaper as well on page 4. But we were asking the question about an explanation for how we got in bed with Jafali and the possible, according to the Star newspaper, the diabetes center promised by Jafali going up in smoke. Will it become a reality, or will we just see it?
Okay, I could understand the Star's question as to whether the center has gone up in smoke as a result of what it calls the Jafali fallout. But here again, you have in the Voice's references to that, there is a paragraph which says, and I quote, "Imagine this billionaire had promised to build a center for diabetes research in St. Lucia, and no announcement of this was ever made again, not until the whole thing was blown in the British and later the local press." So, was the research center story developed as a part of damage control exercise? Here again, the Voice is being less than truthful when it says there was no mention of it, because in the Governor General's throne speech last year, she did make reference to the government intending to present legislation to open the way for the establishment of the center. I don't know if the Voice would have felt better if she had said, you know, a Saudi Arabian billionaire has promised us a center, and therefore we're doing that with the hope that he keeps his promise. That's not the kind of language you'll get from a Governor General in a throne speech. But quite apart from that, the legislation paving the way for the center was also presented in Parliament. It may or may not have been covered or reported by the Voice. So to suggest and to say, as if it is a fact, that nothing was said about the center until after the Jafali divorce issue came out, that is simply not true.
Yeah, I think it raises an issue that we've also discussed here as well, in terms of the function of the media, especially in giving coverage to the Governor General's throne speech, which seems not to be given as much prominence as it ought to be in terms of follow-ups. You know, so if something like that is mentioned in passing, you know, nobody latches onto it.
Yeah, because the Governor's throne speech every year does, one of the main things it does is give an indication of the government's legislative agenda for the following year. So at the end of each year, you could revisit the Governor General's throne speech and see how many of these promises or legislative intentions were fulfilled. But that's hardly done, because they still feel the most media houses treat the Governor General's throne speech with less importance than it deserves, and most political writers and reporters do not give it as much coverage as it deserves, because quite apart from just publishing the speech, you hardly have any, you know, microscopic follow-up as to the governments, because the Governor General is delivering her government, my government, her government's legislative intentions, her government's plans. But then we're only looking at the government, which doesn't make those sort of promises except in the budget. And again, that's another show.
Yeah. All right, let's shift our focus to something more regional. President Obama, I guess regional and international, visiting Cuba this week. I've heard one writer refer to it as a bit of a boxing match, a match between Obama's administration and the Cuban administration, suggesting that it's a bit of a diplomatic tug of war to see who comes out with more on either side. I'm not sure whether that's an accurate, you know, picture to paint. But in terms of Cuba's and the U.S. relations, the coverage coming out of it, what do you see happening?
I see two levels. I see two things happening. One, that President Obama is again ensuring that in his last year he's going to do those earth-shattering things that he promised early and was blocked. The significance of his visit to Cuba, the friendliness of his demeanor in Cuba, the extent of his discussions with the Cuban authorities, the fact that he was able to stand his ground and insist that he would meet with dissidents, the ladies in white, etc., and his own own explanation of why he felt that after 50 years of a blockade and a policy that hasn't worked, he has laid the basis for his successors and for Congress to be able to turn that new page of communication and engagement vis-a-vis punishment. And he had said from day one, over a year ago, when he first indicated his intention to re-establish or normalize relations with Cuba, that one of the main reasons was because he felt that if the United States wants Cuba to listen, then it has to talk to Cuba. And if the United States wants to engage the Cuban people, then the United States has to have a presence in Cuba. So prior to Obama's arrival, you saw Secretary of State Kerry went to Havana to declare open the U.S. Embassy. Now with U.S. Embassy and the personnel, including intelligence personnel and everybody, they're in Cuba, and similarly Cuba having an embassy in Washington which is equally staffed, it means that the U.S. feels, as Obama said, that by being on the ground in Cuba, they could have a better legitimate chance to engage Cubans and try and, you know, sell American democratic ideals to them. The easing of the sanctions insofar as what Obama has done since he came in has turned the tide in Florida, particularly in Miami, which was a hotbed of anti-Castro, anti-Cuba, you know, opposition to the regime. Obama has turned that around to the extent, for the first time in history since the Cuban Revolution, the Cuban exile or the Cuban community in Florida voted for the Democrats and not Republican. As a result of the reason why they've done that is because since Obama came in, he allowed more money to be sent to Cubans, telephone communication, postal communication. He raised the ban on travel so that people could visit relatives more regularly. And then prior to his arrival there, on that last trip, what he did was raise the total ban on flights to Cuba. So any and everybody could just go and buy a ticket and fly to Cuba, and you don't have to hide to have the Cuban stamp.
But not with entirely altruistic intentions. Obviously, Florida, as you mentioned, has had an issue of Cuban migrants illegally landing you know, on their shores. Opening up that relationship with Cuba now also opens up more avenues for first of all, stemming the tide and addressing the issues of illegal immigration between the two sides.
I do not think that the United States wants to stem the tide, because the United States, remember, in relation to Cuba and Cubans running away from the United States by boat to get to Florida, which is only 90 miles away, they have what is called a wet foot, dry foot policy. So they still hold on to the wet foot people, who are those they have caught on the boats before their feet touch land, which would be called dry foot. Because if you get to land, whether in the United States, in Miami, or in the United States Virgin Islands, as we're seeing in the Caribbean, or in Puerto Rico, once you touch, they will facilitate your application. But if you're caught before your boat touches ground, they immediately send you back, process you and send you back to Cuba. So the Obama administration has been doing that more than any other. But they also, the way I understand American policy towards Cuba and the way in which Obama has spelled it out, read it between the lines, I would also say that Obama and his administration are not against and are looking forward to probably more Cubans leaving Cuba to come to America.
Okay, we're due for a break. Let's take the break. When we come back, we continue talking about the Obama visit and the likely benefits of, I guess, to both sides of the thawing of relationships between these two countries. You're watching the Press Club. We'll be right back.